This is episode 17, where we confront the limits of human intuition in the face of global complexity and the pursuit of justice.
And today we're really plunging into a tough idea, aren't we? What if our gut feeling about right and wrong, the one that feels so natural, is just, well, not really cut out for the world we live in today?
Exactly. We've been digging into some really compelling source material that poses this huge question. Why does our ancient sense of justice, which was, perfectly fine-tuned for small hunter-gatherer groups, seem to completely fall apart when it runs up against the sheer scale and, frankly, the tangled mess of our modern global world?
Yeah, and so our mission in this deep dive is to try and unpack just how incredibly hard it's become to even trace cause and effect in this enormous complex system. And crucially, what does that difficulty mean for things like individual responsibility, for justice itself?
So, get ready for some insights that might feel a bit counterintuitive. We're going to explore how size doesn't just make a problem bigger, it actually changes the problem. Why knowing what you're really doing, the impact you're having, has become almost impossibly difficult.
And we'll look at the surprising, sometimes kind of strange ways we all try and, let's be honest, often fail to make sense of this overwhelming complexity.
Okay, so maybe let's start right at the beginning. Where does this sense of justice even come from?
Right. So the material we looked at really emphasizes that our sense of justice, much like our other senses, has deep evolutionary roots. It was shaped over hundreds of thousands of years by the real, practical, day-to-day ethical problems faced by small hunter-gatherer bands.
You mean like concrete situations?
Exactly. Think about the kinds of dilemmas they faced. You're hunting with someone, you get a deer, they get nothing. Do you share? Or someone spends all morning gathering mushrooms, fills a basket, you're bigger. Can you just take it? Is that okay?
Force, yeah.
Or maybe you suspect someone's plotting against your family. Is it justified to act first? Preemptive self-defense. These were the kinds of direct, person-to-person moral calculations they were constantly making.
Okay, so problems involving a handful of people they knew really well, living in a fairly small area. And it's tempting, isn't it, to look at huge modern issues, the Syrian civil war, global inequality, climate change, and think, oh, that's just the same stuff, just bigger.
Right. But that's where the sources say we go wrong. A key insight here is that size doesn't just scale things up. It fundamentally changes the nature of the problem.
So our evolved sense of justice is kind of out of its depth.
Profoundly out of its depth. That's the argument. It's not that people today don't have values. The sources are clear, secular, religious, whatever. People hold strong values. The massive difficulty is actually implementing those values in this incredibly complex, interconnected global system.
And the numbers really drive this home, don't they? That hunter-gatherer moral compass was calibrated for maybe, what, a few dozen people in a few dozen square kilometers.
Exactly. Try applying that same intuitive radar to relationships involving millions or billions spread across continents. It's just overwhelmed. It wasn't designed for that load.
And a crucial part of that original justice was understanding cause and effect, right?
Absolutely crucial. Back to the mushroom example. If you take that basket, you see the result. You see the person whose work you just negated. You know their kids might go hungry tonight because of what you did. The link is direct, obvious, immediate.
But today, it's different. The sources talk about the inherent nature of the modern world being these incredibly ramified and complex causal chains, like a giant tangled web.
Yeah, it's like this huge network. You can live a quiet life, maybe feel like you're not harming anyone intentionally. But just by being plugged into this global system, you might find yourself implicated in things happening thousands of miles away, things you don't even know about.
And tracing those connections is almost impossible. The sources really highlight the sheer level of ignorance we operate under compared to our ancestors.
Think about it. That hunter-gatherer woman knew exactly where her lunch came from. She picked it. She knew who made her shoes, probably someone sleeping nearby, her pension fund, her kids, right there. Everything was local, visible, direct.
And us, today, we're often shockingly ignorant, aren't we? The source gives this example. It might take you years of dedicated research just to find out your own government is selling weapons to some awful regime somewhere.
Right. And here's the kicker. While you're pouring all that time and energy into uncovering that one difficult truth, you're almost certainly staying ignorant about countless other important things, like, say, the actual conditions of the chickens that lay the eggs you had for breakfast. You just can't know everything.
It seems like the system almost encourages this ignorance, or at least makes knowing really, really hard.
Well, the argument in the source is that it's structured in a way that allows for blissful ignorance if you don't actively fight against it. And even if you do try genuinely make an effort uncovering the full, complicated truth of how you're connected to everything. It's incredibly difficult, maybe impossible.
Which really complicates something as basic as don't steal, doesn't it? Originally, that meant physically taking an object. Pretty straightforward.
But today, so much more complex. The source uses this great example. Imagine you invest $10,000, maybe in your retirement fund, into a big petrochemical company. You get dividends, a nice return.
Okay.
But maybe that company is profitable partly because it cuts corners. It dumps waste into a river, destroying the local ecosystem. It lobbies hard against pollution controls. It uses legal tricks to avoid paying for the damage it causes, what economists call externalities.
So, the source asks, can that company be accused of stealing a river? And what about you, the investor? You never went near the river. You might barely remember you even owned stock in that company. Are you guilty of theft? How can we possibly act morally when we realistically can't know all the facts?
And this is where the argument gets really pointed. It suggests that just having good intentions isn't enough anymore.
Right, the I didn't mean any harm defense starts to feel a bit thin in such an interconnected world.
Exactly. Because the consequences of our actions ripple out in ways we can't easily see. So the source proposes a shift, a different kind of moral imperative,
Which is?
the imperative to know. The argument is that some of the worst crimes in history weren't solely driven by malice, but were enabled, perhaps even fueled more powerfully, by widespread ignorance and indifference.
That's a heavy thought. They give examples, right?
Very striking ones. Think of, say, genteel English ladies in the 18th century, investing in stocks and bonds on the London Exchange, maybe sipping tea sweetened with sugar grown by enslaved people.
While completely unaware or choosing to be unaware of the brutal reality of the plantations their investments were financing.
Precisely. Or consider the example of a highly efficient post office manager in Nazi Germany in the late 1930s, described as an upright citizen, doing his job well, making sure the mail ran on time.
Just being efficient.
Just being efficient. But that efficiency made his post office a vital part of the Nazi state machinery, speeding along propaganda, recruitment orders, deportation lists, things that enabled horrific actions. He was a cog in a terrible machine.
So the failure is in not trying hard enough to know what you're part of.
That's the suggestion. There's a moral failing in not making a sincere effort to know. But then you hit the really difficult question. What actually counts as a sincere effort? Should that postmaster have opened every single letter? It's easy for us, looking back with hindsight, to see the whole awful picture.
But in the moment, without that perfect knowledge, how do you find moral certainty?
You probably can't.
Yeah.
And the source is pretty blunt here. It says the bitter truth is our hunter-gatherer brains just weren't built for this level of complexity. We're outmatched.
And this complexity is especially blinding when it comes to these large-scale structural biases, right? The sources emphasize this.
Yes, exactly. Most modern injustices, the argument goes, don't stem from the kind of obvious individual prejudice that our brains might have evolved to spot in a small group setting. They come from these huge systemic biases baked into our institutions, our economies, our societies, and they're often almost invisible.
Which means we're all kind of caught up in them, complicit to some degree, just by living in the system. And who realistically has the time or the energy to uncover all of them?
Nobody. The author of the source material even reflects on their own potential biases in writing the analysis itself, acknowledging they might naturally give more weight to the perspectives of the global elite, the people who tend to dominate discussions and potentially overlook or even silence disadvantaged groups.
They mentioned a specific example, didn't they? About Aboriginal Tasmanians.
Yes, really powerful one. The author admits that in previous work, they had mistakenly repeated the idea that the group was entirely extinct. But in reality, thousands survive today, facing very specific struggles, including some academics actively denying their existence. It just shows how easily entire groups and perspectives can be missed or erased.
And even if you belong to one disadvantaged group and you deeply understand those specific challenges, it doesn't automatically give you insight into the totally different struggles of other groups.
Right. The source makes this point vividly. An African-American man knows intimately what it's like to navigate the world as him, but that lived experience doesn't necessarily translate into understanding the unique challenges faced by, say, an African-American woman, or a Bulgarian Roma person, or a blind person in Russia, or a lesbian in China.
Each experience is unique. The source contrasts the African-American man, perhaps facing routine police, stop something the Chinese lesbian might not experience, but maybe he grew up in a community that taught him specific coping skills.
Whereas the Chinese lesbian might not have been born into a supportive lesbian community, might have had no one to teach her how to navigate her specific identity challenges. Growing up black in Baltimore gives you no easy map for growing up lesbian in Hangzhou. There's different mazes.
And maybe in the past, local understanding was enough, because your responsibilities felt more local.
Perhaps. Sympathizing with your immediate neighbors might have covered most of your moral obligations. But today, with huge global issues like climate change or AI development, things that affect literally everyone, we need to somehow consider all these incredibly varied viewpoints.
But how? The scale seems impossible. How can any one person, or even one group, possibly grasp the complex web of connections between thousands of different intersecting groups all over the world?
It really does feel like our brains just hit a processing limit, doesn't it? Our intuition works okay for two people, maybe 20, maybe even a couple of clans. But millions, billions, entire continents interacting. Our moral hardware just wasn't built for that kind of complexity.
So, given this overwhelm, how do people cope? The source talks about common strategies, right?
Yeah, it identifies 4 common ways people tend to react when faced with these huge, complex moral problems.
Okay, what's the first one?
Downsizing the issue.
Yeah.
You take something incredibly messy and complicated, like the Syrian civil war with all its factions and history, and you basically simplify it into a straightforward story. Good guys versus bad guys. Maybe just 2 main players. Much easier to grasp.
Makes sense. Avoids the headache. What's number 2?
Focusing on a single, touching human story. Instead of grappling with overwhelming statistics about famine or poverty, which our brains find hard to connect with emotionally, you focus on one individual's plight, like the example used, Rokia, a single sick child from Mali.
Right. Charities do this all the time. Studies show people donate more to help one named child than to help 8 anonymous children.
Exactly. It triggers our empathy directly, bypassing the complex analysis. It gives a feeling of moral clarity, but it might be based on an incomplete or even misleading picture.
Okay. Number 3.
Weaving conspiracy theories. If the global economy or political system feels too chaotic and complex to understand, it can be oddly comforting to believe that some small, secret group is actually pulling all the strings. You know, the Bilderberg Group, the Illuminati, shadowy billionaires, whatever.
Because it implies someone is in control, even if it's nefarious control.
Precisely. It makes the complexity seem manageable, even understandable. Although the source strongly dismisses this, arguing the world is actually too complex for any single group to truly control or even fully comprehend.
So those first 3 are basically ways of denying or simplifying the complexity. What's the 4th?
Creating, or maybe clinging to, a dogma. You put your faith in some allegedly all-knowing theory or institution or leader. It could be a religious dogma or an ideology. It offers certainty in the face of bewildering reality.
And the source points out this isn't just about religion, right? Secular movements do it too.
Oh, absolutely. When the complexity gets too frustrating, people latch on to unquestionable doctrines. It provides comfort, a strong sense of moral certainty, we have the answer.
But the big question the source leaves hanging is, does that dogma actually deliver justice in the real messy world? Or just comfort to the believer?
Right. And it also touches briefly on why some broader proposed solutions might fall short too. Like, can we just rely on liberal dogma,
Right.
trust the good intentions of billions of individuals, voters, consumers, all aggregated together?
Or the idea of empowering local communities.
Yeah, the source raises concerns there too.
Hmm.
Empowering communities might just shift the problem from individual ignorance to biased groupthink within echo chambers, which is also not great for tackling global problems that require cooperation and understanding across groups.
And fundamentally, the source argues, we just don't have a truly functional global community right now that's equipped to handle these global challenges effectively.
No. Things like social media platforms or nationalism or even traditional religions, they haven't really created a unified global community focused on finding objective truth or universal justice.
Yeah.
Instead, existing groups often seem more focused on their own interests, reinforcing their own bubbles. Their interpretations of this complex reality might be, well, unreliable.
So if we step back and try to summarize the main takeaway from this deep dive, it really feels like our basic evolved sense of justice, the one that worked fine for millennia in small groups, it's just fundamentally not equipped for the world we've built, this huge, complex, interconnected global society.
Yeah, it really underscores how incredibly difficult, maybe impossible it is for any of us to truly know what we're contributing to or complicit in. The causal chains are so long and tangled. The structural biases are so embedded, often invisible. How do you even begin to figure out how to act justly within all that?
And faced with that overwhelming complexity and our own cognitive limits and these coping mechanisms, we resort to simplifying, finding single stories, conspiracies, dogmas. The source leaves us with that really provocative, maybe unsettling question.
Have we basically entered the post-truth era? Not necessarily because people are lying more, but because the truth of our complex global reality, the full picture of cause and effect, has become just too difficult for our hunter-gatherer brains to grasp.
It's a powerful question to leave things on, isn't it? How does all this complexity affect your own efforts to understand the world, to figure out consequences, and to navigate what it even means to try and act justly today?